Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on blended engagement. My name is Ben Gordon, and I'm the US lead for Citizen Lab. For those that don't know, we're an online engagement and community participation platform working with over 275 governments and organizations around the world. And we've just launched with about half a dozen local governments right here in the US, including Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Speaking of which, I'd like to introduce you to our guests today. In one panel, we've got Milzy Carrasco, the Director of Community Engagement for the City of Lancaster. And in the other, we have Rebecca Woodbury, former Director of Digital Services for the City of San Rafael, California, who now runs her own consultancy, the Department of Civic Things. Today, we'll be talking to you about blended community engagement, what it is, why it's important, and how do you do it effectively, particularly in concert with an online platform like Citizen Labs. We'll start by letting our guests introduce themselves and talk about their communities and their work. And then we'll jump into some specific tactics they've used in conducting offline engagement, and then look ahead towards how these approaches can be helpful as we emerge from the pandemic and as cities begin to think about what to do with their stimulus spending. We've got some slides that we'll show that have some photos to help you visualize some of these tactics and kind of what we're discussing. And I'll share my screen so you can see that. And then at the end, we'll save some time for Q&A. But in the interest of making this more of a discussion, please ask any questions in there should be a Q&A bar. And we'll try to answer them live, as we can. So without further ado, Milzy, do you want to or actually, sorry, Rebecca, why don't we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit about your work in San Rafael and what you're doing now with Department of Civic Things?
Sure, thanks for having me today. So I worked in local government for the last 12 years of my life for the city of San Rafael in Northern California, population about 60,000. San Rafael's just about 20 minutes north of San Francisco. And so, 12 years ago, I actually started as an intern while I was working on getting my master's degree in public policy. And so my journey in San Rafael, I had the opportunity to see local government from different departments, from different vantage points, all the way up to my last post, which was the city's first director of digital service and open government, where I oversaw community engagement, data analytics, service design, as well as IT. So one of my driving motivations throughout my entire career has really been driven by a desire to really drastically improve the experience of government. I have a policy background, and so the policy analyst in me has always wanted to address, the root cause of issues. So I've always been really interested in how governments solve problems. And a key part is really how it engages with the community. So I launched the Department of Civic Things to help more cities and towns, especially smaller ones, with their digital services and their communications and how they do this work. But in addition to this, a big part of this is the culture that underpins the service delivery. And so those are some of the service offerings I have with my new consultancy. But it's really to bring some of the work that I've done to smaller cities that have fewer staff, fewer resources, and how can they do this work?
All right. Great. Milzy?
Great work, Rebecca. Thank you so much, Ben, for inviting me and everyone that's joining us on the call today. It's always a great opportunity to share the work that we're doing here in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We're located about an hour and a half from Philadelphia and an hour and a half from Baltimore. So right sandwiched in between two really great cities. A little bit about our city. There's about approximately 60,000 residents. Lancaster is really unique. Almost 40% of our residents are Hispanic descent. We are per capita the most resettled city in the US. We have like the oldest functioning farmers market. There's a lot of diversity that's here. You can walk down the street, one minute you're seeing a Congolese family, the next minute you see a horse and buggy, Amish buggy, coming down the street. So it's a really beautiful city, filled with a lot of diversity. So really love this city, if you can't tell. But in 2018, we have a new administration, a new mayor, Mayor Denise Sirachi, and part of her administration is really putting the focus of residents first in all the work that we're doing. So typically departments of neighborhood engagements, offices sit in like community planning, maybe a couple levels down. She made this position, my position as a director within the mayor's office that reports directly to her. And really that's the telling story of Lancaster is prioritizing residents in all the work that we're doing. And so our first charge was really to understand what residents' needs were through canvassing. We developed really understanding what residents wanted. We developed programming, which you'll hear about that in a future slide. And increasing external engagement was a priority, as well as increasing internal engagement. How are we connecting residents to project managers was the #1 priority for our department. Some of the areas that we identified as gaps as we were coming in is, remember, our population is almost 40% Hispanic, and we have a huge refugee population. Language access was an area that we really needed to focus on. The other presence was the digital presence. We really didn't have an engagement presence for digital, which leads us to our partnership with Citizen Lab. During COVID, we identified that here's the opportunity we've been talking about having a digital presence. We interviewed a lot of different organizations, public participation platforms, and ultimately teamed up with Citizen Lab for so many reasons that I can share with you a little bit later. But here's a screenshot of what our priorities are. And so the city of Lancaster just recently, if we have some government individuals on this call, just completed the community's priority poll, which is really the consolidated plan. We were able to leverage our partnership with Citizen Lab, develop a platform that's called Engage Lancaster. We explained to citizens and residents what dollar amount that we had, and we asked them, like, what are the priorities for this city and how should we allocate $9 million into the community? Overwhelming response. Typically traditional meetings are town halls. In the past, we've had 20 people show up. So as you can see here from the screenshot, we had over 319 people and plus, because it's continued participating in the community priorities poll. I want to share this because this is really important as you're communicating information out to residents, as well as including residents into the process of allocating funds into the community. As ARPA dollars are coming in, this is like a great opportunity to identify priorities for the city and how can we allocate some of those dollars. Ben, is there anything you want to add to this? You've been instrumental in some of this work as well.
No, I mean, Milzy, I think you summed it up quite nicely. And so, yeah, I think we should, before we go any further, though, I think we should do some definitions just to make sure everyone is clear on kind of what we're talking about. So maybe, and also, I guess before we jump into that, for those of you sharing kind of where you're from in the chat, that's really great. We've got people joining us from all over the world.
Wow.
You know, engagement and participation is a global phenomenon, and so it's great to see everyone, you know, kind of coming in from everywhere. So, but let's kind of keep moving. So we're gonna use the term digital divide a lot today, and I think it probably makes sense to kind of really define what we mean by that. And so, Rebecca, I guess in your own words, you know, what is the digital divide, and what does it look like in San Rafael and some other U.S. cities?
Sure. So, Milzy, thanks for sharing the demographics and the makeup of Lancaster, because San Rafael, similar size city, 60,000 people, about 35% Latinx. And so there's one neighborhood in particular has a large population of largely immigrant population, and it's called the Canal neighborhood in San Rafael. And so you'll see on this slide that it's always a major focus. in terms of equity for us. And so, the digital divide, it's a lot of things. It's a lot of things that I think someone needs to participate in the digital age. So it's the internet connection of itself, I think, which is the obvious part of the digital divide. But even that is nuanced. It's the availability, it's the affordability, it's the speed. And so the internet connection itself is a big piece, but it's definitely not everything. It's the devices that people have and need to fully participate. And it's the number of devices. We're now finding, a while ago, it was fine for a household to survive off one shared computer. But now, especially with students, really, multiple devices are needed in households. And it's the skills that are needed to navigate the digital world. So understanding how the devices work, how applications work on them. So those real tangible skills. Can you open a browser and do you know how to navigate around? Understanding privacy and making sure that you're protecting your privacy. That can be hard for most people to figure out these days online. And then just really how to get things done, how to find information, how to navigate services online. And then, the last piece of this, I think, is really critical because it's, digital literacy, in my view, is not about always putting the onus on the user. It's also about the design of services themselves. And so, understanding your services, are they accessible? Are they inclusive? Are they, is the content understandable? Are your services easy to use, and do they work for everyone? I think that is very much a part of the digital divide, as some of these other things that we're talking about. And so, the pandemic, it forced us to not look away anymore and really reckon with this aspect of our communities that existed before the pandemic. Governments can't leave anyone behind. And with everything moving online during the pandemic, people were getting left behind in terms of school, in terms of getting connected to safety net services, accessing critical health and safety information during the pandemic, and then also participating in local government, having a voice in local government. And so, just like, how we all learned in the pandemic, early in the pandemic, about the supply chain differences between the commercial and residential toilet paper markets? Remember that? We also learned that internet at home isn't really the same as internet at work. Oftentimes, all of a sudden, we were competing with our own family members for bandwidth. And so, and that's for those of us that were lucky to work from home and to stay at home during the pandemic. So, in San Rafael, we knew there was a divide, but we didn't really understand where exactly to focus our resources and efforts. But we definitely knew we needed to quickly form a collaborative, right? Government wasn't going to solve this on its own. And so we, very early in the pandemic, we formed a collaborative of nonprofits, government, multiple government agencies, the schools, and just community volunteers that had skills that, frankly, we didn't have. And then we started to address the needs. We knew we wanted more data. We also couldn't wait for data to happen. So by the time we started to collect some of the data that's on the screen, we had already put a lot of things in motion. But we did know we wanted more data. And so we also knew we couldn't collect a complete picture of this particular issue if we just collected data online. So we coupled an online survey with boots on the ground. Yes, even during the height of the pandemic, we figured out how to do this. We worked with a local nonprofit, Canal Alliance, you see their logo on the screen, and we paid people who lived in the neighborhood to help us collect this data. And they also helped us design the survey data. They helped translate, they helped us use images instead of text to supplement some of the questions. And then we paid them to go out and collect the data for us because people were still gathering in places, largely we had a very, very long line at the food bank multiple times a week. And so they were able to collect 1,500 survey responses from people both in person and online in a matter of a couple of days. So the data that we collected, it reinforced a lot of our assumptions, but I also think it showed a wider disparity than a lot of people really realized. And the biggest thing that this data has done was to really help our fundraising efforts, and really making the very compelling case that we can't look away from this anymore, and we have to do something about it. And so this helped us launch those fundraising efforts, and really largely philanthropic funds during the last summer during the pandemic came in, and coupled with funding from government agencies, we were able to provide people with hotspots, laptops, subsidize internet bills. And also we built a free public Wi-Fi network in this neighborhood. The particular neighborhood Canal is densely populated, and we were able to use the street lights throughout the neighborhood to stand up a free Wi-Fi network. And again, a lot of that came from making a compelling case and going out to our philanthropic community in the county. So government, like I said, it can't solve the digital divide on its own. And it really takes partnerships like this, cross-sector collaboration. And working with community-based organizations is really the way you're going to get it done right. Focusing really clearly on real people, their experience, their needs, and community-based organizations are such a critical way to do that work. And our work was really intentionally designed in an inclusive way, working with community-based organizations as real co-creators and co-designers of the solutions. They weren't just people that we consulted; they were part of the team.
So, Rebecca, thank you. I think that's really, really helpful context as well, because one of the things. So, I guess first, something we hear, and maybe part of the genesis for this kind of conversation today is, this is a challenge we hear from almost every city that we talk to, every county that we talk to. Lancaster and San Rafael are very different communities in very different parts of the country, but they're both facing this challenge. And even collecting the data to determine how severe the digital divide is a challenge in itself. And so, part of the kind of what we wanted to do today was to think about what are the things we can do. Even if under ARPA there's all this money being put into broadband, but Rebecca, to your point, it's so much more complex than that. And so even if everyone were to get broadband in the next month, which obviously isn't going to happen, these things are important because there's so many different dynamics to participating online and participating offline. And it's not, I think it's there's this kind of misconception that it needs to be one or the other. And really what we're advocating for is this blended approach. And so even if everyone were to get internet and become super tech savvy in the next month or 6 months, that this approach still makes sense and is still kind of the right way to do it. And giving, I forget who, maybe we were talking about, Rebecca, this whole idea of no wrong door and giving residents multiple ways to engage. And so I think maybe it's a good time to kind of jump into some of the specific tactics that you all are using, because I think a lot of people say, yeah, blended engagement offline, but then they never get into, what does that really mean? So I want to transition a bit, Milzy, and give you a little bit of a chance to talk about kind of what are some of the specific things you were doing, in Lancaster, and how did they kind of fit in with the Citizen Lab platform, and how did you make it all work, particularly during a pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And Rebecca, echo everything that you just shared. That digital divide is a real thing, especially as we're building community. So some of the programs that we had prior to COVID, and we continue to have, Neighborhood Leaders Academy and Love Your Block were two of the programs that originated from that survey that I shared with you earlier about what residents wanted. They wanted to know, how to access services in local government, as well as they wanted to really engage with their neighbors. So we developed 2 programs, privately funded. And during our programming is when our city shut down for related to COVID. And so we really had to pivot on our programming. So if you could see pictured Neighborhood Leaders Academy, that's part of our local high school. So this is a high school Neighborhood Leaders Academy where we're really teaching students civic engagement, but we also have an adult Neighborhood Leaders Academy and a refugee Neighborhood Leaders Academy. The curriculum's the same, but it's really engaging and activating young people, all sorts of people, understanding what local government is. And then at the end is identifying a key issue that they're seeing in the neighborhood. We fund the project, and as a collaborative, they come up with ways to address some of those issues. So as I mentioned, in the middle of programming, COVID hit. So we met online with students. That digital divide is real. We had students that didn't have technology, so we had to figure out how we can get technology for them. They were teenagers also taking care of young kids while their parents are working. So they're now school, they're teachers as well. So we worked through all of that through the particular cohort that we were part of. But we transitioned, as you can see, building community despite the distance. And so that was really like our tag for all of our programs. We were still able to go out into the community. So we had a digital presence where we were convening all of the group leaders. And then we still were able to go out to the community and really serve the need. So the students decided that they needed to do care packages for a local underserved elderly population in a particular neighborhood. They put together 400 kits and then delivered them. And so that engagement we were able to track online as well. The other program that you see there, Love Your Block, typically ranges from $2,500 to $5,000, where there's a cohort of residents that work together to identify the same kind of concerns and address them. So we pivoted to mini grants during COVID. So we approved 42 mini grants, and the opportunity for people to receive $500 of our mini grants to provide food for neighbors. There's an artist that designed a coloring book of like local residents and then shared that with everyone. We had a local artist that did porch portraits and went around all the neighborhoods and collected 200 porch portraits. We also had a muralist that did a project. So that was really the transition of our programs. We knew that there was a gap. COVID elevated that gap. And so here's our response. We can still do the work digitally, but how can we be really equitable in the work that we're doing? And I think the next slide is really fascinating. So this summer, there was a lot of protesting. I know there was a lot of cities that were experiencing. And prior to COVID, we were in the process of working with a community and police working group here in the city. We were in the middle of our strategic plan, and we hosted about 5 town hall meetings. During the protesting outside of our police department, we decided to ask those same questions of our strategic plan and put huge billboards. And it actually, the public art mural actually, we were able to have conversations with community members and police officers. So community members would post their questions on there, and then the police officers would come out of work and have a response. So there was this dialogue that was happening that was really organic. We were able to document this whole entire process online and also share their responses. We also connected with Citizen Lab and launched a strategic plan for public participation on helping us prioritizing the work to improve community and police relations. And I think the next slide.
So, yeah, and so I think one point just to jump in there is, I think the conversations in the US, at least around policing and the role of police in our communities is a tough conversation to have. And I think one of the outcomes that we were most excited to see is that conversation could be had online on the platform. And one of the reasons we were able to have that and have the confidence to have that conversation was because of the work Milzy and her team did in making sure that we knew that those who were participating, it was not just the loudest voices in the room. It was not just the same 10 people that would show up to your town hall and yell at you about something. It was a really diverse coalition of community members, and as a result, the conversation it was better and
Great.
it was productive, and it
was.
gave the community members a place to speak and a place to share their thoughts. And so that was a big, I think, win for everyone, was being able to host those conversations, because they're not easy, no matter how you have them. So let's jump ahead to Rebecca. I'd like to hear a little bit about your work in California. I think kind of the thread that I'm starting to see here is this kind of activation of public space and kind of meeting people where they are. So you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so for many years, our approach to community engagement has been hybrid, part digital, part in-person strategies. And for many people, engaging online is preferable. It's more convenient. But the hard part is building awareness of the opportunity to engage online and to make a compelling case for them to do so. So letting them know that these opportunities exist for them. And so, if you don't engage a broad cross-section of the community and you're doing these two strategies, you tend to end up with the same people engaging both in person and online. So if you're not managing that, people get two voices. So I think that there is, there's room for a lot of creativity into how we reach this broader audience, how we bring more people into the conversation. And Milzy, you had some just really powerful examples of that. And our digital world, it's getting very cluttered, right? Most people have very clogged inboxes. I don't know about you, but I just delete all the newsletters that I get. And social media feeds, also very cluttered, very overwhelming. So how do we invite people to engage with us? As local government, our biggest asset is our public space, right? That's our streets, our parks, this is our big asset. And so I think there's a thoughtful way for us to activate it. We obviously don't want to also clutter our public space too much, but I think there's a thoughtful way to activate the public space and to engage people in that way. So on one side of the screen, there's a photo. This is a few years back when we didn't have to mask up everywhere. And this is us at a farmer's market. That's a member of the city council. She's actually the mayor now. And we had a booth at the farmer's market where we just talked to people about really whatever they wanted to talk about. Often we would be promoting specific programs and projects and have materials. But in a lot of ways, we just wanted to connect and humanize City Hall, answer questions. We gave, kids coloring books and coloring sheets, and we had a little flyer to give their parents about how you engage with City Hall, and just that humanization and getting out there in that way. We also use a lot of signs in our public spaces. And so this sign is actually how this was a way that we advertised an online engagement platform. So we were collecting feedback digitally, but we used a really, really big sign that you couldn't miss at the location of a playground that we wanted to renovate. And this didn't just have a link to the online platform. It also had a phone number that people could just call and leave a voicemail of what they wanted to see at this playground in particular. And so again, giving people multiple ways to give feedback and share their ideas. And an interesting backstory to this sign was that this actually stemmed from sort of a grassroots movement in the neighborhood. Some young families kind of wanted to clean up the park. They wanted to see some improvements in the neighborhood. And so they actually kind of sparked a movement by creating these really kind of slightly provocative but eye-catching posters that they put all around the neighborhood to sort of bring people together and start having a conversation. And so it's interesting. Our big giant sign was in many ways a response to neighbors activating the public space first. And then another strategy, if you want to go to that next slide, is we do a lot of what we call pop-up workshops. So rather than 7 p.m. at City Hall or at a community center, we'll do a series of what we call these pop-up workshops. Again, they supplement online engagement. So we're doing the engagement online, we're driving people to it, but we're also saying if it's easier for you to just put something on a Post-it and put it up on a wall, we'll take that and then we'll move that into the digital space for data collection. This one in particular, I think this was also a few years ago. This is before we had any parklets in our downtown. And we were doing a downtown parking study. And so I created this sort of pop-up workshop in a parking space outside of an art gallery during like a Thursday night art walk. And I lured people into giving me feedback by giving them coupons for free parking in the garage. So, compensating people for their feedback. But I thought actually the most brilliant design that it was unintended, I didn't realize it, but after having a glass of wine in the art gallery that I was outside of, people were a lot more willing to tell me what they thought about parking. So that was kind of an unintended design that worked in my favor. People were very chatty and talked to me about how they felt. And so going again to where people are, we've done a lot of these pop-ups at places like shopping centers, at parks. As one of them, we actually did just, we have a kind of an anchor, a very large employer that has, a couple thousand employees in our downtown. And on Friday, they have, free lunch. And so there's a really long line for the lunch. And we set up kind of a pop-up workshop for people as they were waiting in line to get lunch. So you can get creative about where to do these things. But again, you're just making it really easy. And the biggest benefit to this is that you're talking to people who, they don't even know where City Hall is on a map. They couldn't tell you the name of the mayor. They're just your everyday resident who isn't typically engaged in City Hall, but you're capturing their voice and you're bringing them in. A big piece of this is that, it's so important for the face of government to be friendly, to be helpful, and to be representative of the community as well. So really making sure that you're conducting outreach in the language that people speak, but it's also just really helpful to understand and communicate the topic in compelling ways to people. So really get on their level, why should they care? Sometimes it's obvious why people should care about things, but sometimes it's not. And so it's really, again, I want to make a point here that working with community leaders and organizations to design and conduct your outreach, I think is a really critical piece of this, because they help you make it contextual and meaningful in the community. Bringing them in early in your design process, not at the end. You've got to bring them in early. And I think another piece of this is give them an actual real seat at the table.
Yep.
You're not a fake seat over in the corner that's facing the wall, right? Make them a member of your project team. Don't have meetings without them, and share all of your data and information with them. Really make them part of the team, and they can influence the design and the outcomes of things in ways that you just never can.
Yeah. I have a couple follow-ups on that. Rebecca, I swear we're so aligned in everything that you're sharing. I really appreciate your comments. Related to some of the internal engagement and having a seat at the table and prioritizing residents and community with that say, it's so incredibly important. And our work when we started here was the biggest challenge was how do we make that process change, right? So how do we really influence the project managers in Department of Public Works and fire and community planning and economic development? How can we really influence that change that we're prioritizing residents in the beginning, because really that's where the engagement needs to happen, even in ideation. And so we struggled with that. I think everyone here for the last 3 years knows the importance of engagement. And there's so many different processes from one department to another. It was really a challenge to really implement that, you know, so it was always like this afterthought. And I have to say, one of the things, so we became, you know, we were the team that was just like, this is great, we need help, let us come to you, like advisory, right? COVID hits, and now we've actually literally became like the kings and queens of City Hall. Everyone's contacting us. We have this project, legally we have to communicate it. Like, how do we get it out? We need this advisory board, you know, we need to, you know, get engagement responses. We need to track it. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be like open. Everybody needs to know about it. And so literally, like, we were having this conversation about a digital public participation platform. And if Rebecca, you know this, in 3 months to doing a big investment and do really planning and making a decision on a project, you know, on a tool for the city, that's actually a really quick turnaround time in government. Normally there's like a longer planning process, but here internally, every single director was part of the interview process for our public participation platform. We ended up going with Citizen Lab for so many reasons, but what that actually helped us with, and what everyone liked here in all of our departments, we were unified in this process. So Citizen Lab helps you unify your projects. So it's a whole outline that you have to identify first. Who are your stakeholders? What is your timeline? What is the information? How are you communicating it in different languages? So all of that really actually starts happening before. So finally, we have this process, right, where we're really including our stakeholders, our community members in the beginning. And so that's where all of the resident advisory boards, the technology training that we had to institute, that really started back in March. And who helped us lead us in that direction has been Citizen Lab, quite honestly. Their training, another thing that we do really great in government is like we get all these really great innovative tools, but sometimes because of budget reasons, we can't really supply the support for that. And so what we all really appreciated with Citizen Lab is our partnership. It also included a project manager that walked us through the onboarding, getting this buy-in from all of these departments and really talking about what this process looks like. How do you communicate it? It's just not putting their project up. You got to make sure that you have like a communications plan behind it to make sure that it's successful. And then how are you, not everyone gets connected digitally. So what's the traditional methods that we're going to really use? Like, so you mentioned, Rebecca, earlier, you know, we're launching the information digitally, but there's people that don't have access to the internet. So we're still canvassing. We're using the same, you know, survey information that we have on Citizen Lab. We do the same survey, knocking on people's door, but then we also can come back and in an Excel spreadsheet, put all that information up and then launch it all to Citizen Lab. So it's all visible. Everyone sees what folks' responses are. So it's helped us create this like internal process that's just been really extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, Milzy, Rebecca, those are, I think, that's really, really great points. And I just want to touch on one thing before we kind of two things before we move forwards. One is this idea, Rebecca, that you brought up of, you know, that is inherent when you do offline engagement, right? Where you're meeting people where they are and the context around that. Like my thoughts on parking are going to be a lot more specific and a lot more, I'm going to feel a lot more strongly about it after I've just spent 20 minutes looking for a parking spot, or if I'm paying, you know, however many dollars to park a car. And that's really the feedback you want, right? Is that is like in the moment feedback. And so, you know, online there's always going to be inherent limitations to online. There's always going to be inherent limitations to offline. So it's like, how do you pick the best from both? And I think, you know, a lot of the work you've done, you know, or the park, right? Like I'm at the park already. How can I take out my phone and message something because I'm there and I have strong feelings about it right now? And so I think it's a really big part of it. And so for us, how, as an online platform, how can we make sure that, I mean, most people carry a little computer in their pockets. How can we make sure that they're weighing in when that context is there? And Milzy, to your point, I'll have to mention this to our Gov Success team, because that'll make their day. I mean, I think this idea that the tech can be the best thing since sliced bread, but if we're not thinking through the processes and how you get buy-in and how you communicate these things, then it doesn't matter how good the tech is. And so it's really great to hear that there's been that kind of internal culture change, because that's kind of what we're trying to do both internally and externally, right? Which is why this kind of blended approach is so important, because it takes time. It's a learned behavior. Oh, I can tell the government that I like this or I don't like this. That's not something that we kind of grew up doing. And so every little bit helps, and over time you start to see that culture change come to fruition. So yeah, I think really great points there. I want to spend we've got some time left, but I want to jump ahead to thinking about forward looking. So the U.S. Has just passed a huge stimulus package, of which a certain percentage is going to be going directly to state and local governments. And so, I think a lot of the cities and counties that we're talking to are trying to figure out, how do you allocate that? How do you spend that money? And so I'm curious to hear kind of, what you're hearing and what you're thinking about. Milzy, kind of what are you thinking about in Lancaster over the next 6 months? How are you going to, it's kind of a unique position to be in, especially last year when everyone thought there would be huge budget cuts and big budget gaps. And now I think a lot of cities and states are like, oh, okay, well, I didn't see this coming, and so I'm curious to hear kind of what you think the next 6 to 12 months are going to look like, especially as we kind of reemerge from the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
Yeah, Milzy, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, thank you, Ben. Yeah, so we're still trying to figure out the guidelines for the for ARPA funds that are coming in. And so we know that broadbands prioritize infrastructure as well. There's possibly more funding related to infrastructure that's going to be released. So there was preliminary guidelines that were released last week. And I know that we're expecting some additional guidelines. So here internally, we have started a priorities document, like what are the items within our departments that we really need to start focusing on prioritizing that may match some of the guidelines. And there's still, we're very new in the conversations. Again, the guidelines, the first level of guidelines were released last week, and we are going to have some planning efforts. And related to this conversation is there an opportunity, as we start to better understand the ARPA funds and how we can allocate those ARPA funds out into the community as well, is to develop a similar project on our Engage Lancaster platform through Citizen Lab, that we were able to communicate and work with residents on our consolidated plan, our 5-year consolidated plan on how we allocate $9 million. And so there is an opportunity, and we're still working through on, what's the funding, what does it look like, and what are the key focus areas. And then I think that's the next stage of that, is once we have that defined, how can we get the community involved in some of the decision making that has to happen here.
Cool. And Rebecca, I know you're in your current work, you're working with a bunch of different cities across the country, right? So I guess, are you hearing similar things? What's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months?
Absolutely. And I think, my advice with these projects is think about the design of how you're going to get the work done, and build in the right elements to these projects. I want to touch on a couple of things that things I've heard both of you talk about today, which a critical component to all of this, perhaps even the foundation, if you will, is the underlying work culture that either feeds or hinders meaningful engagement, right? Milzy, you touched on this. Cultivating a culture where people in your organization internally are willing to try new things is so important to community engagement, because communication preferences, they're always changing. And if we don't evolve our methods, we won't keep up. And so really that willingness to try new things, to experiment, is a critical part of our culture in government that we need to foster more of. We have to continue to work on fostering horizontal and de-siloed collaboration in government, so that departments are aligned around shared goals, that they're not competing for funds, they're not competing for responsibilities, that they're really swimming together, rowing together. The most pressing needs in all of our communities, they don't fit within a single department, right? They are all cross-departmental in nature. And so find ways to invest in your culture and your people and be intentional about it. So this means aligning the professional development opportunities and recognition around these shared organizational values to move your workforce into the digital age. So so bringing back to how you design these projects, what is the training budget as part of these projects? How are you going to make sure that implementation is done justice, right? Oftentimes we kind of shortchange implementation, and we launch something and internally we don't fully know how to use it, or and then we get into the day-to-day operations and we aren't maximizing our investment in the software. We aren't maximizing our use of our tools. And so building that in when you have the opportunity to make sure that you are really investing in people in an intentional way, I think is so critical. And this is how, again, aligning your professional development and your skills training to these organization values, a way to help, again, build a muscle for engagement, that it is a critical part of the design process, right? It's not a checkbox. It is a critical part of the design process for programs and for projects. And professional development, I also want to make a point here. It should be something that every employee has access to, not just your analysts or not just a few. You really want to make sure that professional development is for everyone. New skills, they are so critical to navigating this digital age. What we have found is there is not just a digital divide and digital literacy in the community. You also have it in your workforce. You also have folks in your workforce that you need to bring along, and that need to learn new digital skills. And so thinking about that when you look at your projects and how you can use this funding, we're also, government is going to be trying to do more with less people. And so again, investing in your people is so critical. Learning about how to effectively conduct user research. So user research is such a critical component to how we do our projects, how we do our work. How to effectively do that user research, how to write good content, how to make sure services are accessible and not just the letter of the law, but like truly, truly accessible. All of these skills, they are going to help you build a culture of meaningful community engagement, right? Not the community engagement that's just checking a box, but this is how you do really meaningful engagement. So in addition to upping your tech game with these funds that are coming down the pike, just find ways to continue to invest in your people in terms of their digital skills, and then similarly in terms of bias and cultural competency. So that should also be part of your professional development program, and how to build meaningful engagement. So build your culture, find ways to be intentional about it, and find ways of building that into projects.
Yeah. Wow, Rebecca, that's great. I think the internal components. There's so much that happens internally that affect kind of the outcome of something, and again, it's so about so much more than the tech itself. And so I think all those points are super important. They're going to become all the more kind of pressing or critical, once this money does become available, and decisions need to be made about how it's spent. So we're coming up on, we've got about a little less than 10 minutes left and a few questions here. So I want to get to those, but I also want to maybe ask each of you quickly A lot of these questions are around, I think, kind of maybe for those just thinking about getting started and really kind of for the first time building out their engagement strategy or their engagement approach and thinking about what an online, a kind of a more centralized, formal online platform, and could look like. So it'd be great to hear from each of you, like if you were to kind of get started, what are steps 1 and 2 really in moving forward, and what do you have to do? And that could be internally, it could be externally, it could be a systems or processes thing. How would you kind of just get the ball rolling in your local government?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important to kind of, gosh, I hate this phrase, but like eat your own dog food. So in building your strategy for community engagement, take a user-centered approach, right? So build your strategy use the way that you want people to engage the community on other projects, use it to form your plan. And so really make sure that you put together sort of an action plan or a strategy that is reflective of your community's unique needs, and make the community part of it as well. So I think having that strategy in place is really critical. Also, really be real honest about your staffing resources, and look at how you want the work to get done within departments, and as well as maybe some sort of office in your administration, and really see how that work is going to get done, and make sure that you're putting your money where your mouth is on that. So people really have to know that this is a role that they are going to play. And are you again, put your money where your mouth is. Are you staffing this program in a way that reflects how important it is to you? And so it sounds like Lancaster did that, which is great. Because I think that's just, it's one thing to say we want to do all this stuff. It's another thing to have the people to make it happen.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Milzy?
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, I think for us, step 1 was really identifying what the need was. So there's like this overall perception that there's a need, but really having those conversations with like key stakeholders. And so I have the privilege of being part of the ELT executive leadership team and talking directly to the decision makers in all of the departments. And so identifying, like, there was this need, legally we're binded to do engagement and we need this. So first identifying internally who's most impacted internally. And then secondly, they become your champions, right? So when you talk about like new process in government, who are your champion, who's like the middle group that's going to come along, and then who's the resistors. I think really identifying who the champions are and then who's going to really challenge the process to improve it is really important. And so what's unusual in our process was COVID hit and everyone wanted to be part of it. So we invited everyone to it. And so that's, I think, where the excitement started to happen. And then the second part of it is really identifying the external stakeholders, Rebecca, just like you mentioned, like have people there. And so we have a cohort of neighborhood group leaders that through COVID, we started to meet virtually bi-weekly. And for the last year, that's like an ongoing meeting. And so in and out, we have like 20 members in the community, and they've become like a pseudo kind of board for our department. But we presented Citizen Lab to them and said, like, what do you think? And so the first thing was like accessibility. When we looked at all of the different platforms, for us here internally, we needed something that was going to be easy, and not only easy, Rebecca, for external accessibility, that we want people to use it. So if it's too difficult and they can't use it, then we don't want to, and it's going to defeat the purpose. But then the second part of that was like, going back to what you were saying related to technology, we really needed a program that was user-friendly internally. And so that's that was the balance. So step 1 is identifying your stakeholders. How are you bringing them along through the process, and then launching the program.
Amazing. Thank you, Milzy, and thank you, Rebecca. So we've got a few minutes left and a few questions. So we're going to do like a lightning round of questions. So we had a question about timing, and just I think so. Do you have any sense of kind of how long from like the first, both in terms of like how long it takes to kind of push these things through, and then also kind of working backwards from if you want to engage the community by June 1st, what do you need to be doing in the months before that in order to make that possible?
So it was fairly quickly for us. So about approximately 3 months, and it was really like training and having the buy-in. And we launched our first pilot program, I think it was in July. So, it was pretty quick and fairly easy.
Great. And, I guess there's another question about, so someone asked about resources like books, trainings, and classes. And so what we'll do, I think, is we can send out some of these. I'll ask you both after this, and we'll send out some links and things for everyone. There's a question about tourism and hospitality. Have you, maybe Rebecca, in your work with cities, or in Lancaster, are you thinking at all, how does engagement kind of play in or tie into tourism, hospitality, or supporting local businesses, that kind of stuff? That's for either of you.
Rebecca, do you want to?
San Rafael has kind of some. It doesn't have a super strong tourism industry, so we're not, what you would call a tourist town. But I live in a tourist town, which is Sausalito, right across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. And I think, there's a really great way to activate your public space when you're a tourist town. And so for years, several years ago, I was on the Sustainability Commission in Sausalito. And one of the ways that we engaged our population was in the public space, educating around sea level rise. And we did that in many, many different languages because of the tourism that we had. And so you'll see signs in Asian languages, in all sorts of different languages to educate around sustainability. And we saw an opportunity to engage with people all over the world around that topic in particular. So I think that when you do have a strong tourism industry, you have even more opportunities to educate with your public space.
Yeah, I agree. And kind of last question, and then we'll wrap up. So we had a question about how do you assess efficacy and in these, particularly these blended spaces. And so how do you, once you've done this work, how do you know if you've kind of done it well, if you've used your resources correctly? Like, what do you, how do you think about that? Rebecca, why don't you take that?
Sure. I mean, I think you need to be, you need to think about that from the beginning. How are you going to measure success? And then, because when you ask that question at the very end, you may be kicking yourself for not collecting certain things like demographic data. So, one of the things that you want to do at the end is really check, did we reach all angles of our population? Did we get feedback from a cross section of the community in terms of age, gender, race, all sorts of different ways that you want to make sure it's a broad cross section. But if you don't ask those questions up front, you aren't going to know whether you were successful in that. I think another piece to think about with your public input and the feedback that you're getting is it's one piece of the puzzle. There's other data that you're going to be collecting to inform problem solving and decision making. Public feedback is a big piece, but it's a piece. It's not everything. And so recognizing that the feedback that you get, it should be something that you bring to your decision makers, that you thoroughly look at and you really kind of also gut check what you heard with community-based organizations, local leaders, and make sure that the feedback that you get really sounds right. I'm in a process right now where we've done a very robust community engagement effort, and now we have these kind of working groups that are looking at the input that we have been collecting and saying, does this look right to you?
Mhm.
Does this look like it's reflecting the needs? Are we still missing something, right?
Right.
And recognizing that it might not be complete.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. So I know we're a little bit over, so let's wrap. I guess, Milzy, I want to give you a chance. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Just a great opportunity. If there's anyone that's on the call that wants to reach out, I know Ben's going to be sharing our contact information. And, just one last, for us here, we have a motto. It's on the back of my wall here. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's actually our department model. So, it's just putting people first and listening, acknowledging, and then responding is really the center of all of this work.
Well, I think that's a really great note to wrap up on. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. It's a really great conversation, and I will, for everyone else here, I will share contact information, and we'll send this recording as well as some kind of key takeaways. So for anyone who didn't make it. All right, well, let's let everyone go about their day. Thanks so much, everyone, and
Thank you.
we'll see you around.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.